Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining me today in the icy north, where we're surrounded by birch and pine trees. You can see behind me here a certain structure, and again, with this one, you might be able to tell what it is by looking at the roof. It's a sauna, and it's a sauna on wheels. So we're going to take a little tour of this sauna, how I built it, some of the things that I put into it that or maybe are different from the first sauna that I showed you in a previous video. But hopefully it'll give you some ideas and inspire you to either build your own sauna or just get one and start using them because they're awesome. So let's take a look. So obviously, looking at the construction, the shape is pretty self-evident here, but let's start from the bottom and look at the carriage or the trailer frame that it's actually on. I'll show you some pictures of the original purchase. I bought a camper trailer, a cheap one from 1968, demoed it down to the frame, just the metal frame, and built the sauna on top of that. So you can see right here, this lower part of the frame, that was actually the door and the entrance to the old camper trailer. So I used that low part as storage for the spare tire. So that flap there, what would you call that? The lock board, the cross-shaped lock, holds shut. That's where you would open up to access the spare tire. And then you can see this other panel over the tires. I wanted to kind of keep the tires at a low profile. A lot of the mobile saunas you see have the crank to lower the axle so that the whole unit comes down to ground level. I couldn't do that with the frame I had and that sort of thing. So I kind of made the lower profile, and in order to do that and potentially have to access the tire to switch it out or whatever, I put this panel on here that is held in by 2 bolts that slide open, and then you just take this latch here and hook it on this hook, and then that gives you full access to the wheel well and allows you to change out the tire. So the thing with this trailer frame, the old axle was probably rated for maybe 3,000 pounds at most, but it was also old. So I decided to put a whole new axle on with a 6-bolt wheel hub. And so the capacity is just far greater, not only for hauling down the road, but also for holding people inside. So if you're going to do something similar, I would recommend taking a look first at the structural integrity of the frame to see if it can handle what you want to do with it. One thing I did, and I brought this to a trailer place to do for me since I don't have the equipment to do it, but they put in this extra bar to help reinforce the tongue here, because with the added weight and the added capacity on the axle, I just wanted to make sure that the tongue was strong and nothing was going to bend or break on the highway pulling this. And then you can see the scissor jacks. That's the 2 red ones in the front here. That stabilizes it. So it's a fully stable operational unit that you could pretty much permanently park. And then in the back here, I have 2 scissor jacks, the black ones. And I mounted them in this orientation because that's what my frame allowed for. I'll show you some pictures of the frame as I built it up. Basically, I put 4x4s crosswise going this way, fastened them to the frame with bolts, and then from there, I built up the wood structure. So that's how it started. I'll show you some pictures. And then from there, framed it in. It's a little high. I think the stove stack itself goes 12 feet high off the ground. So it's not exactly top heavy, but it is higher than a lot of the mobile saunas you might see. But a big reason for that is because I wanted the headroom inside. And so you can see with the frame, I simply wrapped it with corrugated metal. That's actually metal roofing. And then the front and the back, I did a board and batten style. And if you saw the previous video of my shed, very similar construction there with the burnt siding, and that basically weatherproofs it, water seals it. And you know, for having traveled, I think I pulled this about 150 miles on the highway, there really isn't any dirt or salt or anything that's stuck on here. So it stayed in good shape, structurally sound. And then here, obviously, you can see some of the trailer features. That's all for safety. I did keep a common theme with these cover boards. That's over the electrical. And then on the windows, I have a similar awning, cedar, just held up with some bolts. So that's pretty solid. This is my intake vent, same thing, kept the similar design. And then we'll look at the back here in a second. But since it's roadworthy, I wanted to make sure I had the reflectors just to make sure if I had to drive it at night, people can see. And then running lights on the top. Blinkers work great. So I had to rewire the whole thing, obviously, because the original did not have the wiring I needed. And I demoed it all anyway. The back is the same construction with the board and batten, but I chose not to fire it and burn the wood. I did seal it, and part of the reason is just to have that kind of difference between front and back so that it's not all completely black, and gives a little character to switch up the style front to back. And then here you see the same little awning boards over the rear tail lights. You got some running lights where I also have blinkers, and then up top. So if you make it roadworthy, there are some highway restrictions as far as the minimum necessary lights. And I believe these two long ones on the side and these two bottom ones are necessary. But you might want to check that. I did put more than I needed, but I just wanted to make sure that this thing was completely visible, especially since being black, driving at night, you know, it's hard to see if somebody's pulling. They might want to change lanes, and you don't want anybody hitting your special structure, right? So that's the outside. Pretty good look here. And we'll enter inside next. So before we go inside, I built a platform because, as you know, I have a fixed axle. I don't have a crank axle that can lower. So the entrance is a little high, and I have the back door here on hinges. And I built it so that it's not easy to break into. You couldn't just unscrew the hinges. And same with the lock here. I do have screws, but it's basically anti-theft proof. Got a handle to get inside, and then I used a natural log as a pull handle. And then this is just kind of an extra safety lever for closing if needed. So we'll open it up, the door, and similar to my other sauna, I have a hinge closer connected to a weight. Basically just have a bunch of metal hardware in there, and that closes the door nice and tight. And some mobile saunas will not have a foyer entrance. I chose to have one in mine. It just kind of keeps that extra air barrier as well. But if you wanted extra spacing or extra seating, you know, it wouldn't hurt to leave that open. Another reason I did put in this middle partition and created two chambers was a lot of these highway camper trailers and things have their structure built into like the cabinets and things. So this wall is also structural. It stabilizes the shell so that when you're going down at high speeds down the road, everything is tight and stable, and you're not going to run into any issues with things, I don't know, wobbling or collapsing. So I also have the interior candle windows. And of course, I keep referencing the other sauna that I showed you in a previous video. Similar construction, that's what's familiar. I like these glass panels that are actually sold as shelves, and they work really well for putting candles in. And so when you enter, this one I carpeted and have a seat if you need to change. I have hooks everywhere for clothing. We'll close the door. And since it's daytime, it's still fairly light. You can still see I got shelving here, but we'll open up to the main chamber and we'll get a little more light here. So this door, similar construction to the exterior. I got my wood log handles. I got my weighted closer here. And the main chamber where all the action happens. So we'll step inside and take a look at how this is a little different from maybe your typical box sauna structure. Looking back at the entrance to the sauna chamber itself, we go up to the arched ceiling. So the arched ceiling here is high enough to where an average height person could stand on this lower bench and still not hit their head on the ceiling. I have been in plenty of saunas that are a little shorter on the ceiling height and you're just always having to crank your neck. So I wanted a little extra height. It feels more airy, spacious, and a little more welcoming than something kind of tight and claustrophobic. So I will show you pictures on how I constructed that. Basically just used plywood forms and then integrated that into the wall system. So here we have two windows, either side, again, tempered glass. The two front windows give me more natural light, and it's the same dimensions as the candle windows. I just put them horizontally. In this sauna, I have all of the walls and everything, even the stove guard as pine. So you can see there's a lot of pine resin that leaks out. And, you know, for some people, that's going to be a problem. They don't like that. They might accidentally touch it and they, you know, it gets sticky resin on their fingers. Eventually it dries out. I like the smell. I like the really gritty, natural effect that it gives. Not just the smell, but also the sight. I just like the rawness, like all this wood bleeding, the resin and the sap. I just kind of like that. But you don't want to sit on it. So what I did for this sauna was use cedar for my benches. So I use cedar 4x4s, and the benches are resin free. And then I put cedar backboards for resting your back. So you're not going to lean into a little sap patch or something like that. So if I can get up here a little bit, you look over, there's another bench there. Have water for steaming and a handle or a nice hot pad for handling the hot metal. Okay, I got a slightly smaller stove. The cubic footage is more than enough, or I should say the capacity for heating certain cubic footage is more than enough for this space. So I don't know if this size stove would work in my larger sauna, but it does the trick here, easily getting to 200 degrees plus in single digit weather or sub-zero temps Fahrenheit. So I have an intake, air intake here. You saw that on the outside, and that just draws direct cold air from the outside to feed the fire. And then similar to all saunas, what you want is a nice draft to feed the fire going up the stove stack, but also on the inside, that convection heat is going to hit the ceiling and then work its way, cool down a little bit, come back down, and you're going to get that nice circulation of hot air that distributes the heat evenly, so you don't have a strong direct heat in any one place. Everything is just kind of nicely evenly heated. And then here's the exterior vent to kind of assist with that convection cycle. I typically have this closed during saunas, but it does help. But I think the design is good enough to where I don't even really need that, or at least I don't need to have it open. So as you can see, I have a stove guard on this one because the quarters are a little tighter than my other sauna, and a little extra safety and bracing is nice to have. I put a higher seat up here with a little backrest where you see the thermometer. That's definitely the hottest seat in the sauna. It gives you a little outdoor look through the windows as well. And I would say total 6 to 8 people could comfortably sit in this sauna. We'll look back again at the entrance just to give you a sense of how things are laid out and the spacing. And you can kind of see just some of the detail with the trim rope, trim around the windows. Not the only way to do it, but might give you some ideas on how to do yours. And maybe one last note here on the stove. I have all this metal, as you can see, and of course that's all heat shielding. It allows you to get the stove closer to the walls without risk of burning or fire. And since the stove is fairly close to the walls, I brought that heat shielding all the way up until it exits the roof here. So nice and protected, safe. You can leave the fire going. Very, very low risk of any kind of fire developing. And then, as always, you want to make sure people's skin, hands, whatever, are protected from sharp edges or hot metal. So I put a 4x4 here to protect from the edge of this metal, which is a little more decorative, covering the intake vent. Bent that corner because it was still a little bit pokey, I should say. And so you can pretty much move around freely without getting a surprise burn or poke from any kind of metal. So that's the interior of the sauna. Little different construction from the other one. Obviously, since it's on a trailer frame, the limitations are a little more pronounced as far as size and shape. So that's what we have. So we'll exit here. I'll kind of show you how this works. I like to have my chamber doors push out so that if you're feeling dizzy or sick, you can easily push out. I don't typically like to latch these at all, just in case, somebody panics, they're not feeling good, I got to get out of here, claustrophobia, whatever. Just a push and a push, and you're out. So, little step here, and we're out back into nature. So that is the mobile sauna. Let me know your thoughts on design, any questions on the reason behind certain decisions, but pretty straightforward. It is insulated. In this case, I did rock wool insulation for the roof arch on the inside in here. And then the walls was partially, I'm trying to think here what I used. I think I used mostly like foam board insulation because I had to be thinner on the walls. It's basically 1.5 inch cavity. So I couldn't use your typical fiberglass or rock wool insulation. Had to go with some thinner stuff. So it's not as well insulated as a more permanent sauna is, but that's just because I had a far more limited space given the frame restrictions. But even so, it heats up nicely and it stays warm. So you really don't need a ton of insulation to have a successful sauna build. So there you have it. My nice little helmet looking mobile sauna. So here's a little history of the mobile sauna. Here's the original trailer, Forester camper trailer. It was built in 1968, and the pictures here are in the process of demo, but when I bought it, it was actually complete and in pretty good shape. The tires were the only thing that really needed to be replaced. But as you can see on the inside, not the kind of furnishings or wall finishings that I could use for a sauna. So I started just demoing it, taking it down to the frame, as you can see here. And there's one more picture of the full demo. This is what it looked like before I started building up again. And then I started with 4x4 timbers, all pressure treated, fastened them to the metal frame, and then basically built from there with the casing and the foundation for the walls. Here are the walls. You can kind of see just fairly intuitively from the construction how it was pieced together. There was no plan, and you don't really need one. You just kind of go, and as it comes together, you start to figure out how to space things out and the best structural engineering. So those cross pieces there are really for structure on the highway. They help stabilize it. And then the arch, I cut those out of plywood, and that's the only way I could get an arch in a fairly quick manner. And then I assembled the siding to all the timber framing around, or I should say the lumber. Got my shell up, completed before I cut any holes for windows. And then once the entire exterior was up, I cut out the windows, and just based on where the framing was, so that I could put in the window boxes and then use the tempered glass to put in where I needed them. There's a view of the roof before any insulation was put in. And this was the next insulation, but you can see I have R21 and then some of the foam board. And then over that, I put in the foil bubble insulation for reflective insulating. And then through the roof, you see I got a nice box as a heat shield against the wood, because you don't want that anywhere near combustibles. And there's mostly a finished product. Here's what the trailer looks like being pulled behind the truck. Pretty much the same size as the original camper trailer, but much taller and a little bit heavier. It's a very well built sauna. I only used screws for everything, so it's safe and secure traveling down the highway. And if I were to ever lose it off the truck, it would not break apart. So there's your finished product.